I'm Elizabeth Vincentelli, and I write for the New York Times.
And I'm Peter Marks, theater critic for the Washington Post. Welcome to another episode of Marks and Vincentelli. Really the only theater podcast you really need to listen to, let's be frank here. And to quote or to cite the great Marie Kondo, you should get rid of the other clutter in your listening queue and just have Marks and Vincentelli waiting for you, because that gives you more time to catch up with our previous episodes.
It gives you joy. It gives you joy.
It does. It does.
That's all you need.
So
That's
true.
all you need.
It's
And
true.
okay, and today, oh my God, the joy we have for you, it's so great. We're adding to our growing list of guests who have won the Pulitzer Prize for drama. It's seriously, we're getting to be pretty impressive, because we've talked. If you remember back when we were Three on the Aisle with the much missed Terry Teachout, we had Lynn Nottage and Tracy Letts on that show, which is still available, by the way, on podcast. And then we last year, I think it was last year, I'm losing track of time. Last year we chatted with Michael R. Jackson, who won the Pulitzer for Strange Loop, and today we are talking with Stephen Adly Guirgis, who won the Pulitzer for Between Riverside and Crazy. Now, he won that Pulitzer in 2015, and the play is just now finally making it to Broadway. It's still running. It's been extended until February 19th. And what's great is that it's also there's going to be a simulcast. So if you're listening to us you're not in New York, you can watch that play online. You can buy a ticket for it, and I think it's going to be from January 31st to February 12th or 19th, something like that. Anyway, if you go to the second stage, we'll put the link in the show notes. But I love that idea. I love that people everywhere can watch this great play.
Yeah, Stephen Adly Guirgis is a major voice in American theater. You may know some of his early plays that he developed with Labyrinth Theater, and in very close association with the late Philip Seymour Hoffman as a director, plays like Last Days of Judas Iscariot, Jesus Hopped the A Train, Our Lady of 121st Street, The Little Flower of East Orange. I hope you're getting the thematic connection there, and of course, and his voice really, it's where he really developed his skill and his following, I would say. Over the years, a lot of people found him by virtue of his first Broadway production, which was in 2011 with The Motherfucker with the Hat, a very funny and smart play.
And yes, so now he's back with Between Riverside and Crazy. And one of my personal favorites actually is from 2019. It was a show that he did with Labyrinth and The Atlantic. It was called Halfway Bitches Go Straight to Heaven, which has to be one of my favorite titles of the past 30 ever. It's just such a fantastic play. It really lived up to the title too. And it really gave a great idea of Stephen's way with dialogue, which, by the way, if you follow him on social media, I highly recommend his Twitter account. It's vastly entertaining.
Yes, on all platforms, he's good.
I know, right? So without further ado, we're welcoming Stephen Adly Guirgis to the show. I am totally psyched to have you with us today. I think my first question is like super general, but also very specific at the same time. I'm really interested in the importance of growing up in New York in your work, because I have a kind of complaint right now where I think a lot of theater that I'm seeing feels like not rooted to a place or a milieu. And there's a vagueness to it that bothers me. And I love the way your plays are really rooted in a very specific place. So I want you to tell us a bit about like growing up here and what it meant for you and your career as a writer.
Sure. Thank you. I always think or anticipate someday in the future that maybe I'll write a play that's not set in New York, that's, set in the French countryside or something, but I mean, I'm from New York. I grew up in New York. I grew up in the 70s, and it was a really specific time. And I don't know, it's just the language of the street always spoke to me. I hear it like music, but also as a kid, I grew up on the Upper West Side, and my parents were like lucked themselves into a rent control apartment. But so we lived in this nice apartment, but my dad was a wonderful dad, but we didn't have any money, so my after school play friends, my friends in the building, everybody had more money. Everyone went to sleepaway camp. They got to take, after school classes, stuff like that. And that wasn't my situation. So I was always trying to adapt to that environment. And yet at the same time, from kindergarten through 8th grade, I went to school up in Harlem, which maybe like socioeconomically I fit more. Mm-hmm. But I was also, I was different there. There was other white kids, it was West Harlem, and there was still some Irish contingent. But I think I grew up in New York trying to figure out how to get by, how to be accepted, So I think that when I was a kid, I wasn't tough. I couldn't fight. I wasn't like a ladies' man. I loved sports, but I wasn't great at sports. I didn't have any skills that would get you respect or whatever, or ensure like your status as a survivor in the street. So I really would just watch and listen and try to, adjust my school clothing, so it would look more like the kids uptown. And by listening, and then eventually I think by being a bit of a class clown, making people laugh, that was a way to be accepted. And in order to do that, I had to really listen how people talked and what people were saying. And I think that whatever ear that I might have came there. And I think it started as a survival mechanism and then later became, I don't know, like I said, like music, in the same way that I love music, in the same way that when I was younger, I was a bike messenger, and after work, I used to go, I knew where all the stand-up comedians were on the street, Washington Square Park and 59th Street. And that too, there was a rhythm and a musicality to what they did. There was a rhythm and musicality to the music that we were listening to. I don't know who's from New York, but it was like the first music was WABC radio. So it was like pop songs, but it was, very diverse. So all those sounds were, and those rhythms were, I guess, internalized. And New York is, it's kind of, I don't know if it still is, but it's the centerpiece, I think, of the great experiment that America is or was trying to be, a melting pot. And so because of my upbringing, I was really interested in all kinds of people and seeing how everybody fit. And I don't know. So I think that, and also I'm from there,
Right.
So all those things had an influence.
Yeah, I would say, Stephen, I was born in Brooklyn, and I can relate to a lot of the things you're describing. My parents moved to the burbs when I was a kid, but I remember, obviously, Cousin Brucey and Herb Oscar Anderson, all those guys on ABC and WABC. That was my station growing up. But I also think, Stephen, it's interesting to hear you talk. I think, the word that always permeates a Guirgis play is authenticity. There's such a sense of observing people from the inside out. I always feel like I learned something about human nature from a very honest place. As however fanciful or specific you become, that is always something I sense and I cherish from your work. And I think it's part of your magic. I think it's one of the reasons your plays, are presented everywhere, produced over and over again. The thing you didn't mention in your growing up in that part of Manhattan, and which is only a few blocks from theater, was that was theater itself part of that matrix of experiences for you as a kid?
We didn't have money to go to the theater, but we would go once in a while. And my mother would take us to do things once in a while, and she would always say, like, I just want you to know that this is out here, So, every once in a while she'd take us to a restaurant to eat, so we would, be able to have that experience. I remember seeing Scapino with Jim Dale.
Oh my God!
When I was young, and
then Circle in the Square.
Yeah, and then many years later, he was being honored at New Dramatists, and I told him how much it captured my imagination.
Wow!
And I went to Catholic school, but they were pretty progressive. So I remember they took us to see Sister Mary Ignatius Explains It All to You by Christopher Durang. So I remember seeing that. I remember seeing Godspell at the Second Stage on 75th Street, and whenever I was able to go to theater, it was it was a great experience. But no, it wasn't a regular thing. What was regular was, my mother was very strict. We were only allowed to watch a half hour of TV a day when I was a kid. But like on Saturday nights, she'd let me stay up and we would watch like Mary Tyler Moore, Bob Newhart, Carol Burnett, on those shows. Whenever it was like the Oscars or the Tonys, I would stay up and watch it, because that's what my mother loved. My mother wanted to be in the world that we get to participate in. But she grew up in a specific time with a specific set of circumstances, and it wasn't really an option for her, but she loved it, and she kind of imbued that love into my sister and myself. And, I end up, being in the business, and my sister too. She's a producer, and she's works in film. She was one of the producers on Questlove's movie that won the Oscar last year.
Wow!
Oh yeah, that was great.
My sister's like the brains of the family. It really is. It's like, if you're an actor or a writer and you do something well, even if you don't do it that well, people notice it because it's on the TV or it's in the theater. But my sister's been, first she was in acquisitions and then producing, and just everything. She's brilliant. So anyway, the two of us ended up doing this stuff because my mother really, really just loved it and put that love on us.
Do you remember a moment when you thought, I can do this, I will do this, in terms of theater?
Yeah. I mean, I think I always wanted to be an actor. And I remember in the third grade, we did a production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But like the casting was, you pick the role out of a hat.
That's good.
And I got the Wicked Witch. And everyone started laughing. And, I forget the name of the teacher. His sister was like, okay, we'll pick again. But in my head, even as a little kid, I know that's a good part. So I was like, play the Wicked Witch. I could do it. And she let me do it. And and then I don't know. I always wanted to do it, but I always there wasn't a lot of opportunities, just like school plays. One thing that really, really changed me was, and again, it was my sister. I was in college for a long time, and I knew I wanted to be in the theater, but I thought at the time that you had to major in something sensible, and so I just cycled through everything you can major in, and I was just a bad student. And anyway, one time over Christmas break, I got a present from my little sister. My sister's 7 years younger, so I'm probably like 20, she's 13. And with her babysitting money, she bought me a ticket, and it was like a Ticketmaster ticket. So I was excited. I was like, oh, it's a rock concert, because I love music. And I looked, and it was a play. And I was like, oh, and it was Burn This, by Leonard Wilson. And she got me a ticket for a matinee. And I was like, I feigned excitement, but I was a little disappointed. But I went, and, obviously he's a brilliant writer. But when John Malkovich started yelling off stage before that first entrance, something happened to me. And I went back to school and I became a theater major. And I was like, I don't know if I could do what he does or if I could write stuff for other people to get to do what he's doing. But like, I want to do that, So that was a kind of significant moment.
That's so interesting. Stephen, it's so cool to hear you talk about where this all comes from. And there's a wonderful freedom, that I feel in your writing, and also very tied to your Catholic education at some level. I mean, the first play of yours I ever saw was The Last Days of Judas Iscariot. And from there, I would follow along. You had a kind of thematic connection, at least in terms of the imagery that you were falling back on. Was it that the education had that kind of impact on you?
Yeah, I guess between my mother and her, her upbringing, which was Irish Catholic, and a lot of beauty in it and a lot of ugliness in it and manipulation in it, and that Catholic, it's hard to shed. I don't know how to say it. And right. I remember when I started writing the Judas play, Labyrinth Theater Company was like, "Well, what are you writing for our retreat this summer?" And I just said, "Last Days of Judas Iscariot." I didn't even know what I was saying, but I remember thinking like, yes, I mean, there is a sort of a spiritual quest or trying to sorting out that's been going on in my plays. And I remember thinking like, all right, well, why don't I go back to where things first went haywire? And it was, I remember, I was like a good kid and, and I listened and I believed in God and this and that. And then one day they told the story about Judas and how, he betrayed, Jesus. And we're not saying he went to hell, but he went to hell, it was despair. And I was a kid. I was probably 8 or 9. And I remember just something went dead in me because I remember thinking like, if there's a God, if I can understand how Judas might have messed up, then why wouldn't God? And how could there be any final punishment? I'm sure that if I had asked the question of my teachers or the nuns, I'm sure they would have attempted an answer. It wasn't like, George Carlin went to my grammar school too, and that was a different generation.
Wow.
And when I got there, they were a little more progressive. I'm sure they would have tried to answer the question. I'm sure my mother would have tried to answer the question, but I couldn't even ask the question because I felt, I don't know, I was afraid to ask. And then, my mom had a bad back, so like I was expected to go to church, but we didn't go as a family, so they just give me the collection money and then send me on the 104 bus uptown. And I would, get off the bus at 116th Street and play video games, So I felt like I was bad anyway. And then this thing didn't make any sense. And, and so anyway, you start, getting older and I reached a point where I needed to understand or believe in something. There needed to be something that I could. And the plays emerged from there, and Judas was like, all right, let me go back to the drawing board.
Fascinating.
It was good. It was a good experience. I think the play is, it's very flawed, but the pursuit was honest, and the experience, that's where I met Father Jim Martin, and we became friends, and everybody, it was worthy. And in fact, they're having some celebration for John Guare that Kushner is organizing, and they asked me if I'd write something about John. And when we did Judas, I remember, I worked really, really hard, but intellectually or whatever, it was probably above. I was treading water. Let's put it this way: when I did research, I started by like watching movies. Slowly working my way to like actually having to read stuff, and then I remember when, and writing, during the process, poor Phil, I mean, he really did an amazing job of like
Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Yeah. Keeping it all together. And, anyway, And then finally the reviews came out and they were mixed, and it was sort of the first time that it wasn't like just rubber stamped. Oh, Guirgis is great.
Interesting.
And I remember me and Phil, we were at the performance that Brantley was at, and Brantley's been very good to me. I'm not complaining about Brantley, but we were in the back and we were just like, we knew it wasn't, we knew it was like a matinee. Anyway, when the reviews were mixed like that, I felt like I let down my company. I felt like I let down God. Like I didn't leave the house for a while. I was just sort of in my house and hiding out. And then one day, I guess right around the time that the play ended, I got a phone call from someone else who couldn't pronounce my name. And they were like, "Excuse me, is this Stephen Guirgis?" I said, "Yeah, yes." And he said, "This is John Blair. I looked your number up and information. I just saw your play. And let me tell you, and he said a lot of nice things. And, and it was the first sort of, it let me get back out of the house.
That's
and
great.
Go back down and see my friends. And that play is, again, as flawed as it is, probably I get the most heartfelt correspondence about it because the people that it touches, I guess it touches. So.
I feel that's often the case with shows that are so-called flawed. They may hit a smaller number of people, but I think they hit them harder because there's often something in them that is just less, maybe not predictable, but less consensual, or and that's going to find an angle into someone, and it's going to get them deeper in a weird way. And I found that like some of my favorite things are quote unquote flawed, but they're the ones that I keep thinking about. You tend to be attached to something that may, like, you feel it just speaks to you, because you're the only one who gets it in a way.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit? You briefly mentioned Philip Seymour Hoffman. Can you talk a bit about the importance of the Labyrinth Theater Company in your work? Because it was formative for so many people, not just you, but it was a huge thing for so many. And I think its influence is both a knowledge and I think a little undervalued in New York. And I'm not sure why, but I think it's one of the key companies of New York in the 90s and like the past 30 years. Can you tell me a little bit about, for you specifically, what it meant when you fell in with that crowd?
Yeah, I mean, it meant everything, is it possible that I might have been a writer and not, had I never been part of Labyrinth? Maybe, actor, maybe, probably to some degree, but Peter mentioned authenticity. And one thing is that when I joined that company, first of all, no one knew who we were, So like actors like David Zayas, that was just in Martina's play. He wasn't even an actor. He was a cop. We would meet at 53rd Street from, 8 to midnight. Then everyone would go to the bar. And then 4 a.m., we'd be stumbling down 9th Avenue and you'd hear the police siren. And it'd be David because he was working midnight to 8,
Oh, well.
So he was, he was very raw, but he was funny. And I liked him, And when they asked me to do some writing, it's like I was raw as well. But I guess I was funny, And so we were all really sort of grew up together, and we challenged each other. Phil Hoffman was in a play of mine that got done at Here in 97. And then that experience, we were friends, but that was what really sort of bonded us. And so the next time that I was writing a play, he said, "Well, who do you want to direct?" And I said, "Why don't you direct it?" And he was like, "Well, I never directed before." And I was like, "Yeah, but I never wrote before." A couple of years ago. And I knew that with Phil that I had the freedom and the challenge now to write whatever I wanted, and that he was going to understand it emotionally and intellectually, and that he would be able to communicate that in a way that would ignite the actors. And really, I think we began a process where we were just constantly igniting each other, challenging each other. And so we got better. You know, we got better, and you know, Labyrinth, we're still here, but you know, with our worst quality has always been infrastructure. You know, when you first start a theater company, you got to apply for, what is it? I forgot what it's called, a 403(c)(k), blah, 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 blah.
501c3.
Right. And most companies form and they apply for the 501c3, they get their organization, and then they start doing theater. We were always just doing theater while this was going on. So it wasn't our strong suit, but it meant everything to me, you know? It meant everything to me. And also there were voices for what was in my heart, you know? John Ortiz and I and Liza Colon-Zayas, you know, we all went to college together. And we could never we went to Albany State and it was good, but we could never get cast into main stage plays. You know, we were always like the servants, you know? But I knew John had it in him, you know, and Liza and John, I guess, knew that I had it in me because I didn't, and I still don't, and I still struggle. And I, you know, at 12:59, I was like, okay, how am I going to pretend I'm a normal human being right now, you know? But John had this outsized faith in me and in himself and in this sort of mission to make theater. And and in fact, when I auditioned for the company, I didn't get in. I auditioned, they put me through like 5 callbacks, and then I didn't get in, and they voted 3-2 against me. And then John Ortiz stood up and said, listen, you got to take this guy. I promise you, I don't know how, but he's going to pay a dividend somewhere.
Oh my God.
And they you know, they agreed. But, you know, that was good for the company, but it was like everything for me because I learned, you know, Paul Calderon, the actor.
Sure.
You know, like he, at the time, his nickname was the Pope. Because like he was like a star to us, you know, and he really took mentoring
great presence
seriously. You know, he taught me how to, no matter how I'm feeling, like I might be nervous around you, but I'm gonna when I walk into the room and see you, I'm gonna look you in the eye and say hello, and I'm gonna say goodbye. Like all that type of deportment stuff. I learned from him. Him and his wife Kathy were the first people to give me a typewriter. Because I was writing plays longhand, and then one day Paul was like, Stephen, come over here. We have something for you. He comes out with this huge typewriter, and I was blown away. And I remember, like it was an old IBM. It was like the size of
electric.
Truck. Yeah, it was huge. And you know, I'm carrying it home, and I was thinking, like, wow, Paul thinks I can write. Paul giving me a typewriter.
Wow.
I must think I'm a writer. Now I realized later at the time, like they lived in like like a studio on 86th Street, and that thing was so big they were probably like, how can we get rid of this typewriter? Like, give it to Stephen. And that might have been true too, but he was smart, he was kind. You know, we'd have auditions for plays. I didn't get cast in plays there right away either. But whether you got cast or not, you'd always get a call. It's not going to go around this time, but blah, blah, blah. You did a wonderful, you know, and it meant a lot. And it taught me, and I do that, you know, to this day, like 99% of the time.
You need it. It's what you needed.
I still need it, man. I still need mentors, and I still need to be a part of community. I don't do well in the absence of it.
Stephen, I love, you know, I follow you on Facebook, you know, and it's a greatly entertaining platform for you. But I especially love the devotion you show to Philip Seymour Hoffman, to Phil, as you call him. I can tell, you know, the love was very deep for him and respect. Did he influence the course of your writing? Was he someone that you would bounce plays off before you finish them, or you know how much of a synergistic relationship did you have that way?
He was an influence over everything for me, to be honest. Like we were friends, you know, and part of having friendships with people that are, you know, either like successful or smart is like at a certain point you have to take them off the pedestal, not just for your own sake, but for their sake, because they want a friend, you know? But, you know, certainly in the beginning, I mean, we were very close for like 15 years. And I would say in that time, he was probably the only person that I would listen to and at least consider. Like, he was the only one. And it was really like, yes, with the work, but it's just as much or more for life. You know, I went to rehab in 2006. I didn't want to go. I went and talked to Phil. Phil was like, go. And I was like, I went. I was there the next day, you know, and yeah, with work, you know, like when we were, when I was writing Jesus Up the A Train, which is a play that was set in a prison, right? And at the time, there were scenes that took place outside the prison. There was like a prosecutor then. There was there were these scenes, and I guess like, you know, I'm a decent writer. So when you're a decent writer, everything kind of sounds good, you know, and everyone's like, oh, I love that, you know. And so we'd have readings, and it wouldn't necessarily be useful because everyone's like, it's great, like, okay.
Right.
And then I remember after a reading one time, Phil was like, you know, I mean, do what you want, but for me, the most interesting scenes in the play are the ones that take place inside the prison. And, you know, I had just been up for like, you know, 96 hours cramming this and that. And I was like, oh, yeah, cool. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, who cares what your opinion is? Okay, good. That's a good opinion. Now, I'll write the play. When the play's written, then you direct the play. You know, it's not an interactive. You know, I got home and thought about it, and I was like, yeah, the best stuff is inside. You know? So,
right.
You know,
you needed to like metabolize it. You need to like make it your own. You know, it's like when someone says it so pisses you off. I know that every writer feels that to some degree.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't tell me.
I mean, obviously, it would be. I would be lying if I said he didn't have an influence creatively. In fact, like in the beginning, I didn't know if I actually was a good writer. I was like, well, maybe it's just like I can write dialogue, and I'm just trying to fucking make Phil happy, you know? You know? And thank God, you know, we went through a process where I got to learn that wasn't the case. And when we did the mother, you know, with the hat,
Fucker with the hat,
you know, I wanted him to direct it. You know, I mean, he's directed everything. I was like, direct it or play the sponsor. And he didn't want to do either one. And he was like, let's just concentrate on our friendship. I think the last play we did, critics started to go after him a little bit, and he was like, I'm inhibiting your progress. You know, blah, blah. And I was like, Phil, like, we've been doing plays for like years where like I'm writing in rehearsal, you know, you're dealing with 15 actors, you know, we're doing all this. Here's a play it's actually written. It's good. It's going on Broadway. So why don't we do this and kick some butt, and then we can go fishing or camping, you know? But he was adamant about it. And I think maybe in retrospect that play and that subject matter was a little close to home for him. And maybe I didn't realize it at the time, but I look back on that and like, if Phil had died and I hadn't had the experience of succeeding on my own, you know, but I had to go and work with Anna Shapiro, and she was great, you know, and then working with Austin and you know, and I learned that, no, I am my own, you know, for years people were telling me like, well, you know, Phil gets a lot out of this too. Well, Phil gets, and I would always be like, I don't know, you know, but yeah, it was impossible for me to separate what he contributed to my life personally and professionally. And also the reason that I want to keep him in the, you know, in that light is, you know, for us that were close friends, you know, the people who were like really close to Phil, when we talk about Phil now, and it's kind of like probably a defense mechanism against pain, we tell stories, we tell the bad stories, and we laugh and we make fun of him, and we're like, Jesus, you know. But I remember when he started not doing well. And then I started hearing stories that were not in character with the person that I knew and loved. You know, it bothered me. And so among my friends, could tell stories about him, like never being wrong, and like all this other crazy stuff. And we used to fight about stupid things.
Of course.
But the fact is that he was probably, other than my mother and father, the most important person in my life. And it was completely, you could not separate the artistic from the personal. If anything, the personal was more important and more, that was the thing about him, was that he, until that struggle reappeared in his life and took him down, he was the best person that I knew. And it wasn't because he didn't have flaws. He had plenty of them, but yet he would show up for people time and time again. He was one of the least selfish or self-interested with his time of anyone that I ever met, So yeah, I mean, I mean, that's just, my therapist was like, I don't think you've ever properly grieved, Phil. That might be true. I don't know. But he was, even now, even in death, I still think about him, talk to him at times, specifically with work stuff. There's a picture of him I really love that I have in New York, my desk. And, it's just a special, I love the guy, I love the guy. And, so I could talk about that for, 5 billion hours.
I hear, Stephen, I think about the characters when you describe some of your feelings about Phil. I can feel parts of that in the characters in between Riverside and Crazy, among other plays. I feel that what you're describing are values that I recognize in these very beautifully drawn, complex characters that are clearly deeply felt by you. And I also want to say, I think writing dialogue is the hardest kind of writing that a human being can do. I think to reveal character through conversation is an art unto itself. But I see where, this is still infused in your writing, these elements of that we don't necessarily always appreciate in human beings, their generosity, their loyalty, that are overlaid with flaws, that are overlaid with problems, and that don't diminish them, just make them harder to understand sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I say we all contain multitudes, and that's really real, and one of the things that I'm still trying to figure out with my mom. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my mother and my sister one time, and she was telling us something, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, she was so kind. Like, she was like unfailingly kind and generous to other people. And we were like, Mom, you're so kind. And she said, like with a straight face, she was like, oh, honey, I'm the least of his creatures. And it became like a joke. We used to laugh about it, But she really kind of believed that, and she grew up in an abusive, kind of horrifying set of circumstances. But I always was interested and maybe even haunted, because I think a lot of my mother just got implanted onto me. My mom told me stuff about her upbringing when I was probably too young to know about that. But she needed somebody to talk to, I guess. And it was me. My dad, they loved each other, but he was always working. He's from Egypt. He wasn't touchy-feeling. Her sister had lived through the experience, but her sister was in denial. My mother would bring stuff up, and she would be like, I don't know. It wasn't until my aunt was on her deathbed that she said to my mother, I know what you did for me, So I was always kind of haunted by how much of what my mother is because she's a good person, and how much of it is because she was somehow brought up in this thing to think that, like, you have to be selfless to the point of, like, cutting off your own legs. And I think I've inherited some of that. And that spills out into the work. then also, just like I said, that we contain multitudes. And I've always had people in my life who, I've had some people in my life that I wouldn't necessarily be able to defend if you were like, hey, he did this, or, but that's not all they are, and now that I'm getting older, I'm finally starting to get a little bit hip to boundaries and starting to see some of my glaring deficiencies in that area. But if I'm gonna fail, I'd rather fail in the direction of empathy, trying to understand, kindness. I'm sure you guys go through this to some degree as well. As we get older, it's like when you're young, you want freedom, and then when you get older, you want security, and that can lend itself to, so I got to really fight to keep my mind open, my heart open heart, open mind, open heart, open mind, because, the world has had its effect on me for 58 years. And there's a side of me that can be very reactionary and judgmental and blah, blah, blah. And there's, I think, a war going on, between those two parts of me, and it spills out into the work. And I have great family of artists like Stephen McKinley Henderson, like Phil, like John Ortiz, Liz Canavan, Liza, Rosa, all those people. The journey that manifests itself into work, we're taking it together, and that they can be my voice. Because, the existential struggle of, half Irish American, half Egyptian, Upper West Side kid, maybe it's interesting, I love Woody Allen. He made a whole career based off of one thing, but that's not me. But I found that you can, I am in all those characters,
Well, it's particularly brilliant to me because one of the things that I really love about your writing is that you write such incredible female characters. And there's this whole debate right now about pretty much write what you know, write who you are. And I get it. I get it. We need more female playwrights on Broadway and everywhere. But I really strongly believe in the power of the playwright and the fiction writer to project himself or herself into someone different. And when I watch a play like Halfway Bitches Go Straight to Heaven, the women in that show are just, they're so alive and complex and I wanted that show to go on for like 10 hours. I was like, I want the director's cut. I want the director's cut I just wanted to listen to them for hours because that felt like the point of the show in a way. Like structurally speaking, it's fueled by dialogue and by storytelling. So it can be an hour or 3 or 10, But so how do you work that out? Like, because you just mentioned this family of actors that you work with a lot, mentioned some of those names. How do you work that with them, for example? Because you must have like a shorthand at this point. You know each other. How does that? What kind of feedback do you give each other?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And the genesis of that play was we were at our retreat, and I was working on something else, but I had a little time, and I had to present something, and I was taking a look around, and in the landscape of the active membership at the time, I was like, the best actors in this company right now are women, and so just as a experiment, I just started to populate a world with women. And there was a shelter around the corner. There was a whole thing, but it started from there. And in terms of, again, what Peter was saying about authenticity, it's a case by case basis, and I'm well aware that, there will inevitably come a time where I'm going to write some stuff that's not as authentic. You get older, you see it. I see it in older playwrights, like, that you don't always get it right. And for me, being sort of a mutt from the beginning, I was in a theater company that initially was strictly Latino, then became multicultural. And so for me, getting it right or making it feel true was something, it was, that's the job, right? So how do you do that? Like, I think Elizabeth, that anybody should be able to write whatever they want. You have that freedom. And if you get it wrong, expect to hear about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And if
that's
you get
the
it
deal.
right, maybe you'll just only hear about it a little. At the beginning of Halfway, that we did a reading, and then there was an employee at the Atlantic who was a trans woman, and she saw some of the pages, and she was really offended, and she was sort of demanding that the play be pulled from the schedule, and all this stuff, and she wanted to talk to me, and I wanted to talk to her, and anyway, eventually we spoke. She left the job, and we spoke, and I hired her. I was like, look, I got to write what I'm going to write, but if you're interested, I'll pay you some money, and you can be a consultant, and I will listen to whatever you have to say. You could read as much or as little as you want. At the end of the day, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, but let's have that door open, and it helped. She disappeared quickly. I think she got a job in Asia, but one thing that she talked about was the trope of the trans characters, that they always have to be a martyr. They always end up dying or this and that, and that was originally in the play. Liza's character was gonna eventually attack Este's character. And then I left my lunch at Five Napkin with this woman, and I was like, you know what? Why don't we have the trans character be the one who stabs the other person, But anyway, everyone should be able to write what you want, but you need to have respect for the subject matter, respect for what you don't know, and then you have to just be sort of fearless and take your best shot at it. But if you are imbuing characters with humanity, if they have strong needs and desires that they are in active pursuit of, in the work, then the chances of the characters being more fully formed and feeling authentic or recognizable increase. And if you don't, and you just half-ass it, then you're going to have some half-assed shit, and people are going to say no.
Yeah.
We should leave you alone soon, Stephen, but I just want a couple of other questions. One of them, I think we should just tell the audience, Stephen has at the moment a play on Broadway. I happen to think it's the best play on Broadway right now, called Between Riverside and Crazy. Not to be too evaluative and judgmental, but and it focuses on, he mentioned Stephen McKinley Henderson, who plays Pops, this cop who it was injured on the job, had a long-standing lawsuit against the city. A lot of it revolves around that issue, but it's populated. It really is about a man, I think, who exists in a state of grace. He accepts people into his home who might not necessarily be the best people to, the most responsible human beings he could find. He's got a big heart, and it's a story that's very funny and moving, and I think is as good as any play that Guirgis has written. I'm curious to know, Stephen, about Broadway and what that signifies. You've been on Broadway before with Motherfucker with the Hat. Actors of high caliber want to be in your plays. What does it signify do you think, for playwrights today to have their plays on that platform, to have serious plays by playwrights with lots to say on the most visible platform in the country? Is that something that is meaningful to you as in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, growing up in New York City is meaningful because I used to deliver packages to those theaters, and second act plays, and I love the theater, and so yeah, of course it's meaningful, and one way that it's really meaningful is and it's really happened with this play, especially is that so many people in this play making their Broadway debut. I mean, the same thing happened with Motherfucker. But it was different, because it was, it was Scott Rudin and it was just a whole different experience. But here, even the understudies have made their debuts. And, I remember a few years ago, I was fortunate enough to win some award, and there was and the ceremony was at Lincoln Center, and they were like, you can invite anybody you want. So I just invited, all my friends, and there was a young actor who went on to understudy in Riverside, and they did a really great job. This event, like the bar had like good drinks, there was good food, they really did it. And this kid came up to me and he's like, I just want to say, man, I've been here before, but I never felt like this was my place, but like, I feel like this is our place.
Wow.
Tonight. And so for one thing, for like the community that I am a part of, somehow like normalizing these things is still a thing. It's still a thing. Like to do a play doesn't, we did the plays in all the small theaters and amazing, and I no, we can be here. And these stories are worth time, but it's got to be good though.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And that's what I tell, because a lot of young artists of color are getting opportunities now. More than what was before.
Absolutely.
And when they ask me for advice, I'm like, this isn't really advice, but make sure it's great. Because if it's not great, that's all the excuse that people need for like, see, hey, but. And really, my understanding, I don't pay as much attention to the business of Broadway as I'm sure you guys do, because that's part of your job. But it's like, from what I understand, it's not back yet, that there's still a process, and that, but yes, I'm immensely grateful, all of us in that company. I mean, Steve McKinley Henderson, the oldest person in that cast, his wife having like life-threatening surgery at Sloan Kettering while we're in rehearsal, never misses a performance. The only person that, for some reason, is like COVID proof, like in the whole, the whole company. The all those people in that cast, they lead with love and with their heart, and I try to do that as well. And if it's Broadway, great. And I'd love to come again, I'd love to come again. And I think there's certain plays that I think need to be out there that haven't been seen yet. And I hope that I could be together enough to write a couple of them, But by the same token, I mean, I loved working at Here. I loved working at Intar too. I loved working in the theater, but it does. I'd be lying if I said that my source of pride is that my friends are on Broadway. My friend Gary Perez is one of the founders of Labyrinth. He was the other guy who voted for me. It was 3-2 against me, right? John Ortiz and Gary Perez. Gary just made, he replaced Michael Rispoli. He made his Broadway debut 2 days ago. That kind of stuff, that's the stuff that I will quietly puff my chest out about, because I feel like I'm participating in not just something for me, but for all of us, it has meaning. And that kind of loyalty is my experience has been, it's reciprocated and it grows itself. It grows itself out. It started, years and years ago, with Sam Rockwell. I know we're out of time. I won't tell you the Sam Rockwell story, but
oh no, come on. Now you have to.
Very, very quickly. I got cast in a independent movie, and like 2 days before they started shooting, they fired me. And they're like, Stephen, we love you, but it's a very low budget. And they thought I was like a method actor or something, because I like to prepare. And they're like, we're going to be shooting on the fly, and we need someone more experienced. And I was devastated. It was the end,
Gutted.
and gutted, exactly. And then one day I get a call from Rockwell, and we were friends, but we weren't that close friends. Like Sammy was just like too cool for me, but we were friends, And then he's like, hey, I got a call about this movie. blah, blah. I thought you were in this movie. And I was like, yeah, no, I know, man. They fired me. But, yeah, don't worry. Just do it. It's going to be, it'll be good. And he's like, they fired you? Why did they fire you? And I was like, well, I don't know. Because we both studied with Bill Esper. I was like, they thought I was method, blah, blah, blah. And there was this pause. And he was like, huh. And now, at the time, this is true. He was delivering burritos on a bicycle. Now, yeah, he did some independent films. But, like, that's it. That's what he did. And there was a pause. And he was like, you know what? Fuck them. I'm not doing it. I'm turning it down. And I remember thinking, like, this kid had no reason to be loyal in that way, but he was. And there was another guy in the cast who I actually was pretty close with, who was playing, like, my sidekick. And after Sam turned it down, not only did this guy take the part, but he didn't even call me, But that's the
cutthroat.
Kind of stuff, Sam could rob a bank, and I'd be like, you don't understand. I know the man,
I hear you. I love that. I love that about Sam Rockwell. That's a great story of friendship. I love that.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you so much. Thank you know what? It could be like halfway bitches. We could do like part 2 and 3 and 4. Go on and on. We'll save that for your next one.
Someday, maybe when I stop, I'm about to say it. I'm like, no, that's a bad idea. But
yeah, right.
I really have learned a lot from critics, from reading critics, and occasionally not even about my own, sometimes my own work, but other. And I try to keep a wall. Like, I don't want anybody to so they'll be like, but
right. Yeah.
This has been enjoyable, and I wish there could be more of this, because I know that you guys could probably help me, and helping me would help everybody, because this thing is very interdependent, right? And it's not assured. Broadway's not assured, right. So. Anyway,
it just takes goodwill on both sides, if you will. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to be able to talk, and we share this love, and we depend on you, Stephen, for sustenance and understanding why we do this job. So we greatly appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks so much for spending this time with us.
Oh my God. Okay, so clearly that went a little long, but I felt completely energized, almost kind of like when I leave one of his shows.
That's so nice. That's a lovely compliment.
I really do. I feel like I feel like I just drank a coffee, like a really good one.
Speaking of drinking coffee, Elizabeth texted me during the recording of the show and said, just so you know, we can hear you slurping. I was absolutely slurping. So if you heard those if you hear those sipping noises, that's just me wetting my lips.
We have excellent mics. I'll just put it this way.
We do. We have good
mics.
So anyway, that's it for us on this episode. We'll be back with another one very shortly, we promise.
Well, because, can't stop us now, just like Freddie Mercury almost sang. So Peter and I are on Twitter and post.news, which I actually do check. So I'm on both. And my handle is at evincentelli on both. And Peter is at Peter Marks Drama on both. So until next time, why don't you just go and see some shows, especially between Riverside and Crazy.
And, of course, you can find us at marksvincentelli.substack.com. Tell your friends. Bye for now.